every time I see something that looks worse than we've ever seen before, I think of this passage and think, well, Jesus said this. He predicted this. And sure enough, that seems to be the trajectory that we're on.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined, as I always am, by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Well, thank you, Sam.
It's good to be with you, Richard, and we are here to help take your leadership to the next level. And we are always grateful for our listeners. And I was reminded again, if you are listening and you have questions, you can submit those to podcast@blackaby.org.
Yeah.
We always like to hear from our listeners, even though sometimes I'm bad at checking that email. So I will vow to be better at that. And we've also got coming up another coaching workshop, spiritual leadership coaching, that'll be happening this fall.
Yeah.
In October, and you can find out more at blackabycoaching.org, and we'll have a early bird rate for those who do sign up in advance, $100 off. You can find out more at blackabycoaching.org, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes.
I think we may have mentioned, but I've got my dates, May 18th to 2026. I'll be back at the Cove.
Okay, save the date.
Have a great. Don't even know what I'm talking about quite yet. I've got some ideas.
Come, it'll be good.
But save the date. If I know there were some people that had to back out, couldn't come, and it's just a lot of fun reconnecting with lots of folks.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of praying right now about what could I do a deep dive in. There's usually about 4 sessions and a Q&A, and so several things on my heart to kind of get into a great Bible study on, but just hold those dates, and at least until you find out what I'll be talking about. So if you want to join me, you didn't plan like to get married that same weekend or something.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're kicking off today. I think it'll likely be a mini series. The
might even be an epic mini series.
Yeah, a mini long series. But we do these occasionally, and it's a lot of fun too, just because we get to dive deeper into a topic that can't be covered in one episode. But today we want to kick off a series, length TBD, but on leading in the end times.
Yeah. Yeah, and Sam, as some of you know, I did just recently a time at the Cove on the book of Revelation, and there was there was close to 400 folks registered and filled up the room. It was a great time, but there is a lot of interest in the end times, and certainly with a lot that's going on worldwide today, with natural disasters, with wars, with political conflict, with evil permeating all manner of society. There's a lot of people wondering, are we in the end times? What will that be like? Should I be concerned? And if you're leading an organization or you're leading a family and you want to prepare them and you want to be prepared yourself, what does the Bible say about the end times? And so I want to just do a little bit of a study. We'll see just how much we get into it, but there's a few principles I'd put out there at the very beginning, and this you can use this in whatever Bible study you're doing, whatever topic you're interested in. If you're looking for answers on a certain subject, and so one thing is, I would say distinguish between the Bible and theology. And that's important because ultimately...
And what do you mean? Like, someone could say, well, isn't that the Bible is theology?
Yeah. Well,
what's the difference there, Richard?
Yeah. I would
define
say...
our terms.
Obviously, whatever you want to get your view on, you want to go to the Bible itself and say, what does the Bible say? And there are certain verses that speak about this, and so you can go, for instance, the end times. You can go to 1st or 2nd Thessalonians. You can go to Revelation. You can go to Daniel. There's passages in the Old Testament, the New Testament. There's things Jesus said. There's things Paul said. There's things Peter said. And so depending where you go, of course, typically what happens is that if you go to any of those passages, it's not a complete summary. Sometimes, like Paul might have just been talking about, like when he wrote to Thessalonians, he said, there were apparently some people that just thought, well, Jesus is coming back soon, so why bother paying off my mortgage, or why paying my bills, or why go to work at all? And they just were kind of waiting, assuming any moment Jesus would return. So
they've sold everything. They've moved to the mountaintop.
Yeah, and
all right,
they're kind of getting low on groceries. But is he coming soon? And so Paul writes a letter, and he's addressing the end times, but it's specifically about that kind of attitude. And so Paul doesn't write them and say, okay, here is a complete analysis and description of how the end times are going to work out. A lot of those passages are just touching a particular issue. And so if you go to the Bible and you just maybe take one verse and say, well, see right here, it says this. Well, it's going to be true because it's in the Bible, but it's not the complete picture. And so you want a biblical theology, you want a biblical view of whatever it is, and that means what are the verses that say that? And those always have priority. But on the other hand, a theology of like the end times would be that where you take all of the various verses and comments and perhaps principles that underlying throughout Scripture, you pull all that together and you say, okay, now how can I, like a puzzle, how do I take all these pieces and get a comprehensive picture together? And so that's kind of what theology is. It's like, okay, how do I just kind of, drawing from all these verses, now let's put this into some kind of order, some kind of form. Here's the starting point, and then here we go step by step. And so, and now the challenge sometimes with that, now that's good, because if you want like a theology of prayer, well, there's great verses on prayer. A lot of those verses highlight different things. One verse might highlight perseverance in prayer. Another might highlight faith in prayer. Third one might highlight the fact we don't know what to pray. The Spirit of God needs to show us. And so you draw all those different verses together, and now you come up with, here's my theology of prayer. And you start with the foundational things, and you work your way through. So it's very helpful because it's much more complete and comprehensive.
And the idea, I would think, is to be as comprehensive, to hold as comprehensive of a theological view on whatever topic as you can.
Yeah.
Because you can see the danger in building a theology on a narrow set of verses can lead you into some wonky territory.
Yeah, exactly. And you end up with some gaping holes, or you overemphasize faith or overemphasize perseverance, but then you underemphasize knowing what to pray for or the Spirit guiding you. And
I think there's no theology that has more pitfalls than eschatology.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like the end times. There are a lot of areas and a lot of incomplete theologies that you can find.
Yeah.
No matter where you look.
Right. And that, of course, is what makes it so difficult. And so the danger sometimes with theology is that it's kind of like if you're putting a puzzle together and you're missing some pieces, you can just sort of assume what should go there. And, well, this just makes sense that if this and this, then that. And so the danger sometimes with theology is we sort of tend to fill in the blanks. And we develop a system, and it's just easier to understand something like eschatology or prayer if you have a system. And so theology is kind of the system that helps you make sense of things. And that's not a bad thing. It's not bad to have theology, but the danger, as we'll see, is sometimes our theology takes us places that the Bible doesn't. And that happens sometimes with eschatology in particular, where I'll say, people will adamantly tell me, well, this is going to happen. It's like, well, where in the Bible does it say that? Well, it doesn't explicitly say that, but if this and this is going to happen, then this must have to happen as well. So all that just to say, you want to go to the bedrock as much as possible of actual Scripture and not just Because I've had people just adamantly tell me that this is like the Bible truth. This is how it's going to be. And it's like, well, where does the Bible say that? Well, it doesn't exactly say that, but if this is true and if that's true, then this will have to happen. Mm-hmm. So be careful. That's why I always say, so I would say distinguish between, is this from the Bible or is this from my theology? And both can be good, but be aware of what they are. And secondly, I would say, just as a general rule, always when you're dealing with more complex or confusing issues, always start with the most straightforward thing first. Before you get to the mark of the beast or the dragon or the millennium, start with what is very clear and is not perhaps hidden in apocalyptic language or poetic language, but it's straight talk. And so always kind of begin with the foundation. What is it that's clear? And then you move from what's clear to starting to address what's not so clear. But be careful, because I know a lot of folks want to immediately jump to the snazziest, most unclear, apocalyptic, epic sort of verses, but the best way to handle that is to say, well, what do we know for sure? What's clear? Let's get all that on the table, and then we, from that vantage point, we start to address what's not so clear. And kind of just a third thing to say with that is, again, this is maybe just my principle, but if Jesus said something about it, to me, that's kind of more bedrock. And so now he didn't address everything. Paul and Peter, they talk about things that Jesus maybe didn't really ever address directly,
or at least wasn't recorded.
Addressing. That might be a better way to say it. So, but if Jesus did say something, oftentimes Jesus doesn't speak as apocalyptically as like Revelation does. He doesn't speak poetically like maybe Psalms does or whatever. And so Jesus is answering questions. Like he's come to make things clear. So he's trying to share truth. So a lot of times I'll begin and say, well, what did Jesus say? And then that doesn't mean he covered everything, but let's start as a foundation. What did he say? And so just kind of practicing that, I thought, if we're going to talk about the end times, let's at least look at what Jesus said about it first. Before we get to Paul or John, what did Jesus actually say? And so to me, the go-to passage in this regard is Matthew chapter 24. And so I want us just in the next perhaps couple of podcasts just to walk through this chapter and see what did Jesus say about it. And then we may branch out and say, okay, well, what subsequently after Jesus, then what did others say that perhaps fill in some gaps?
And I think all too with a view to say, with this knowledge, how then should you lead?
Right.
And I think that's what it comes down to.
And we've talked in recent times about leading in crisis, leading in, difficult times. And certainly, it would be interesting to know what the Bible tells us that we should be preparing for. Because there's some theologies that say the world is just going to get better and better and better. You just hold on; it's just going to get better. There's other theologies that say no, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So, now does that make a difference as you're preparing for the future? Which theology is biblical or not? Mm-hmm. And so, so this we want to kind of draw some leadership principles, practices from this. But let's just start right at the beginning of Matthew 24, and it says, as Jesus left and was going out of the temple, his disciples came up and called his attention to its buildings. So a lot of times I think context is important. And so Jesus he's had the triumphal entry. He's come into Jerusalem. And now this is his last week. And this is intensive teaching. He's going to be crucified at the end of the week. And so this is his last chance. Any of his teaching that maybe is going to get recorded in the Bible, this is the time to teach it and make sure his disciples, whether they fully understand it or not, at least they've been told. And so they're leaving the temple. And of course, the temple at that time, King Herod the Great, had done some massive building and expansion. He'd built out the whole Temple Mount area to what a lot of it's still there to this day, 2,000 years later. And he had built this massive temple overlaid with gold and all these kind of outbuildings. And it was the center of Jerusalem. There was always lots of traffic going through there. It was a world wonder. And Herod, for all of his paranoid, murderous, egocentric issues, was a great architect, was a great builder. And he built, of course, Masada and other things, built a whole mountain that in which he was buried in, and just incredible engineer. And so the disciples are leaving, and it says that they drew his attention to the buildings, and he replied to them, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you," and of course every time he says "truly I tell you," you know that whatever he's about to say after that is going to be hard to believe. That's in the old King James. It might have read, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee." And so what he's saying is, I'm going to tell you something that's going to be hard to believe. And he says, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. And so the context of this whole chapter, this whole talk, is stemming from admiring this magnificent structure that they've just been in. And if you've been to the Temple Mount, some of the stones just in the foundation that just holds the platform together, underneath which the temple was built. Some of the stones are as large as a bus, like a bus transport. And these are massive solid stones that were hauled into place and are still there to this day. And so, the temple above ground wouldn't have always had stones that big, but they were still impressive. And Jesus is looking at these massive stones and saying, there won't be one of them that's not thrown down. And of course, that word "thrown" is important too, because that indicates human action. If he had just said, not one of these stones will not fall down, well, there were earthquakes that came along and leveled buildings. But thrown down means that it foreshadows a violent time of assault where an enemy is going to be just purposefully destroying this beautiful building. And the disciples can't even imagine that there could be that kind of force, that kind of strength, because this was such an awesome building. And at the time, of course, the Roman legions were occupying Jerusalem. And Rome was the most powerful country in the world. So if the most powerful country in the world is in Jerusalem, how is this going to get destroyed? So it would have been very confusing. And so it says that while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, so of course the Mount of Olives is just across, there's a little ravine between where the Temple Mount is and then the Mount of Olives. And so when you're sitting on the Mount of Olives, you can, if you're sitting the right way, looking the right way, the temple is just right there in front of you. It's a great picture, photo op. And so they're sitting on the Mount of Olives. Maybe they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, but they're somewhere where they can see that the temple looming before them. And with that context, Jesus begins to tell them about what's coming. And so it says, while he's sitting there, it's called the Olivet Discourse, is one of the ways. Perhaps in the subtitle of your Bible, maybe it calls it that. It's just what he taught while he's sitting with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And it says the disciples approached him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And so those are kind of maybe three questions. And one is just, when will these things happen? And so what they're asking is, when will this temple get destroyed? When will these stones be thrown down? That's the context of what they've just been talking about. And so they want to know, well, when is this temple going to be destroyed? But then also it says, and what is the sign of your coming? Now, of course, Jesus hasn't been crucified yet. He hasn't been resurrected yet. So they don't clearly understand necessarily what they mean by coming. We would think now it's talking about his second coming, but the disciples would have just probably thought, like, when are you going to reveal yourself? When are you going to take over, Jesus? Like, when are you going to...
They're still thinking that, he hasn't made his play to bring his kingdom.
Right.
Right.
We read this now and just think, they're talking about the second coming, but they wouldn't have thought of that. They haven't understood that he's going yet. But they do understand that he is the king, the Messiah, and at some point he's going to take over. And surely that's going to be connected in some way with the temple being thrown down. And so, of course, they still believe in the temple. They know that there's more to it. They know that Jesus has the answer, but they're all Jewish men, and they support the temple. Even after, in Acts chapter 3, the disciples John and Peter are still going to the temple to pray. So they can't quite understand, like, what would it take? Why would the temple ever be destroyed? And so that must be part of the end of the age. And so Jesus, is that when you're going to step it up then? Right. And then also it just says finally, and what's the sign of the end of the age? And so their sort of theology was, at some point the Messiah is going to rise up and free Israel, set up his kingdom, and then for the rest of time, the world will be ruled by the Messiah and his people. And that's kind of their view. And so, and at that point, things are going to stay the same ever after. And so, they're asking kind of threefold question, like, when will these disasters happen in Jerusalem? And Jesus, when are you going to finally reveal yourself and kind of take over this whole world government thing? And then finally, when is just time as we know it, when is that going to just come to an end, and life as we know it? And now it's just it's heaven on earth. It's heaven. It's life ruled by God directly from now on. And so those are the three questions. And now what Jesus is going to do is he's going to start answering them. And one of the things that makes it a little bit confusing is sometimes you're not quite sure which question he's answering. Is he talking about just the destruction of the temple, or is he talking about his second coming? There's like 2,000 years separating at this point those two things, and so a lot of time is going to pass between some of these events, and so that's the context. And so Jesus replied to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you." Which ought to tell you right there that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to have false explanations for this. False teaching is going to come. One of the phrases that John will use a number of times is the idea of the Antichrist, the person who's the opposite of Christ, the false Christ. And so what Jesus is saying is, there are going to be a lot of false teachers coming who are going to be telling you stuff that's not true. And I think sometimes we feel like, oh yeah, there'll be these really strange, mystical kind of weirdos coming in with long robes that have these really crazy ideas.
A bunch of cult leaders.
Yeah, trying to just sell things outside of airports or something, their followers. But the fact is that a lot of these people are going to be maybe even in the church. They're going to be respected Bible teachers on television, but they're going to be saying things that just aren't true. They'll sound true,
right? And
they may even quote scripture to back it up, but it's not going to be true. And so he says right off the bat, this whole topic, this whole subject is rife with false teaching, with deception. And so when you're addressing this subject, be very careful. Watch out, he says. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. And so now some will come flat out and say that they are the Messiah himself. Others may just come as a Messiah figure, as just the person with the answers. hey, you've got all these problems. I have the answers. And they may claim that they have the answers from God or the power of God, but there'll be many wannabe messiahs who'll come and say, just follow me, and I have the answers you're looking for. I can lead you to life. I can lead you to success. And obviously we're seeing plenty of such kinds of people today that rise up and say, just listen to me. I have the answers that you're looking for. And Jesus said that's going to be a sign of the end times, is that there'll be many people that are claiming to be someone that has the answers. And they'll say, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. And then he goes on to say, you are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. So now what he's going to say is, of course, for the last 2,000 years, there's been plenty of wars. And people have actually said that in the 20th century, more people died from war than in any other century before, and perhaps even in all the centuries before, just in terms of numbers of people killed. Of course, there's more people. The population is bigger now. But he's saying, war is certainly going to be a part of it. When you think about the end times, one of the signs is going to be war. And so, of course, there's always been war, so that just because you see a war doesn't mean, we must be in the end times, there's a war going on, or there's a rumor of war. He says that is going to be characteristic, certainly, of the end times. But it says, don't be alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. And, of course, that's an interesting comment. Like, what do you mean they must take place? Like, that can mean at least two things. It might mean that God has prophesied or spoken that certain things are going to happen, and so because of that, they have to happen first. Or it could just mean that for God to work out his plan, that they're part of the plan. Again, that doesn't mean that God necessarily causes wars, causes killing, but it might be that he just knows certain things need to take place before his plan is fulfilled. But he just says, and by the way, not that you are ever going to be happy about a war taking place, but when there is a war, when there is violence, I think as Christians, rather than wringing our hands in fear and dread, I think we need to understand every war that takes place is drawing us just a little bit closer to the end, the last days. That there are some things that just must take place for whatever reason that God understands. And so you can be all upset about this war, or you can realize Jesus said this was going to happen and that certain things had to happen. And so that's just one more war that you can check the box. That's happened now. That's brought us just as much closer to the end. But it says, but the end is not yet. So clearly, because there's some wars, don't think that every time a war is about to break out, it's the end of the age. I remember years ago, back in the 80s, there was a young guy that I was kind of ministering to a bit, and Russia invaded Afghanistan. And there was some fear at the time that perhaps the U.S. would retaliate or intervene, and it would lead to a world war. And I remember this guy, he prayed to receive Christ. I think he was probably saved at the time, but he did it out of fear. He did it out of fear because that war he thought that was the end of, that was the beginning of Armageddon here. Russia and the U.S. are going to finally go at it over Afghanistan. Of course, that didn't happen. But he thought that this is it. This war is so big and it could be so global and nuclear that it's all over. And so Jesus says, just know there's going to be wars, but that doesn't mean it's the end. And then it just goes on to say, for nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And so famines and earthquakes, so natural disasters as well. So he's talking about man-made disasters like war, and then natural disasters like famines, earthquakes, in various places. So not just where they live, but around the world. And so I think certainly as a Christian, you want to be aware of where in the world right now are there wars, where are there famines, where is there an earthquake. Again, it doesn't mean just because there's a devastating earthquake that Jesus will be returning by lunchtime. Mm-hmm. But it says those are all, just know, every time one of those things happen, Jesus said these are a sign of his return, of the last days. And the last verse just to look at today is just verse 8, and it says all these events are the beginning of labor pains. And we'll see next week another sign, but there's two key phrases, I think, in this whole chapter that I think are pivotal. My dad used to always point to these two truths, and this is one of them. He says these wars, these famines, these earthquakes, they're the beginning of birth pains or labor pains. And Sam, you and I are not experts in labor pains. We have witnessed them. We've tried to bring comfort in them, but we've not experienced them. And so I'm a little out of my knowledge experientially, but I would say this: what is kind of commonly understood about labor pains is that there's two aspects to them that you can take to the bank, and one is that those labor pains will become more frequent. At first, you get a contraction, and then there could be several minutes before the next contraction. And if you've ever timed those, if you've got a midwife or a doctor that's going to deliver this baby, they're going to want to know how much time between the contractions. And of course, as it gets closer, you know that the baby's about to be born. And the second thing you know about contractions is that they become more intense. So the first one might be fairly mild. And I mean, again, I don't want to minimize even an initial birth pain.
Right.
But what you do notice,
compared to
they get worse and worse until right before the birth is the most pain, the most intensity. And so what Jesus says is wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, these various disasters, false messiahs coming. He says basically all of those things were happening when Jesus was walking on the earth. 2,000 years ago, all those things were already occurring. But the first thing he says, I think that's crucial to understanding the end times is that they're going to become more frequent and they're going to become more intense. So an earthquake perhaps destroyed a couple of Galilean villages in Capernaum in the first century, but when that same kind of earthquake happens in a populated Asian city, far more people die from it. There's far more destruction. Or hurricane hits and an isolated part of Florida back in the 1800s. Some trees fall down, but not a lot of deaths and buildings destroyed. But it hits Miami today, and that's a whole different story. And so these are just more intense and more frequent. And so as we saw, there's never been as many wars as there was in the 20th century that passed us a few years ago. And so now we're watching to say, you shouldn't be surprised that there's a war now and then, or an earthquake or a famine. But watch and see, are there more people dying from these than there used to be? Do they seem to be happening more often than they used to be? And right before the birth, things will be the worst. And so you get the two things just to conclude today with is, one is that when you there's some theologies that say that and that we may get into a little bit later, that the church believers will all be raptured out before this happens, before it gets really bad. There's a certain theology that says, well, fortunately, when things get really bad, all of us believers will already be with Jesus. But this, what you'll notice is nowhere in Matthew 24 does Jesus say that. What he said, he's talking to his own disciples, and he says, here's what you need to be watching for. Things are going to get worse and worse, more intense, and then right when it seems almost that you can't bear it anymore, I'll come back. And so the idea seems to be that as Christians, don't expect to kind of get the pass from the tribulation times, because it seems like it's going to get pretty intense. And as leaders, we should not be surprised when things seem to get worse. And although we want to do all we can to be salt and light, Bible says that the world, society is going to gradually get worse in a lot of ways. And so just to be aware of that, and so to kind of prepare yourself for that. But what we'll see next week is right when you think if it gets any worse, I'm not sure what we'll do, then Jesus says, and then I'll return. And so at least initially, it's kind of looking like things will get worse and worse, and then he'll return. And so every time I see something that looks worse than we've ever seen before, I think of this passage and think, well, Jesus said this. He predicted this. And sure enough, that seems to be the trajectory that we're on. Yeah, well, I have a feeling this will be a very rich, and it already has been, a very rich study. And I look forward to however many parts this ends up being. So until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.